Alrighty, at this time, I would like to introduce you to our speaker this afternoon for the Leading Through Change webinar, Shannon Studden. Shannon Studden is a Senior Program Specialist with the National Rural Health Resource Center. In her role, she provides education, coaching, and technical assistance to rural health leaders. With over 20 years experience designing and delivering educational programs and facilitating team events, Shannon brings expertise in the fields of leadership and organizational development, collaboration, change management, continuous improvement, and conflict management. She has a Master of Science in Industrial Organizational Psychology from the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. Shannon, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Andy, and welcome everybody. I'm really excited to be here. This is one of my favorite topics to talk about, is kind of people's experience through the course of change. And Andy, can you just let me know if the sound gets goofy? We've got some jackhammering going on upstairs. There's never a dull moment in our office building here.
Oh, yeah, you sound good to me.
Okay, thanks. So can we close the poll? It looks like we've got moderately familiar as our top and moderately confident as our top for the second question. So this slide should look familiar to you. You all probably know this, but just to remind you that the center's primary mission is to sustain and improve healthcare in rural communities. And we focus on these 5 core areas that are listed here on the slide. So change is part of all of your work in healthcare. And as I was kind of preparing for this, I noticed that the word transition is right in the title of the program that we're all here talking about today. So just generally, if you work in healthcare, you're part of more changes than in many other fields, even though change is part of a lot of different people's experience in the workplace. But the purpose of this program is really just to help you implement even more changes to help prepare for the transition to value-based payment. And so when you think about change, it's a huge part of the professional lives of everybody on this call. So, and again, in preparation for this, I took a look at some of the project summaries that all of you are working on for this program, just to see what kinds of changes you're all working on. I talked to Rhonda a little bit about it too, and I found some major changes that should look familiar to a lot of you. So this slide shows just a handful of examples of some of the things you're working on. And these are big things. So implementing leader rounding, increasing barcode scanning rates, implementing telehealth, growing a swing bed program. There are a lot of really big things going on here. And then in addition, we've of course been managing through all of the incredible changes that the pandemic has generated, as well as the social justice and racial equity movement taking place in many locations, really all over our country. So with all that's going on, we thought it might be helpful today just to share some insights and strategies for managing through these changes. That being said, there are so many things that you're all working on right now and have had a lot of success in, that I just want to recognize that all of you have a lot of experience and expertise in this area. And my suspicion is you all rated yourself kind of middle of the road in your confidence in leading groups through change. And I suspect that you underestimated your abilities a little bit, because I know you've had a lot of successes in this area. So if you do have strategies and ideas to share as some of these topics come up through the course of this webinar, I really encourage you to share those in the chat box, because you've all got a lot that you can teach to each other. So here are our learning objectives for today. I like to think of objectives in the form of kind of questions that we'll answer. So here are the questions that we're going to answer. Why do people react differently to change? How can we help other people navigate the change process, as well as managing helping ourselves navigate the change process and managing our own emotions? And then before we leave, I'll give just a little plug for a podcast series that we put together here at the center, really targeting mid-level leaders, but it could apply to just about anybody, about just the experience of change, helping yourself through change, helping others through change. And it's a series of 6, and in 5 of the 6, we've brought in practitioners, so mid-level leaders in rural healthcare organizations who had some perspectives to share in the podcast. So today we're going to focus on the experience of change and how to help yourself and other people through it as it's happening, rather than kind of the formal change management steps to follow ahead of time. We'll walk through a few things that you can think about and a few tools that you can use when you run into challenges. But before we move on, I'd like just to ask you to think about or to have a current change or an upcoming change to kind of hold in your mind as we go through today's content. So Andy, could you, oh, this isn't a poll question, we're doing this in the chat box. So in the chat box, could you just throw a couple words in there about the change that you have in mind? So something that you're experiencing now or something that could be coming up that you can just kind of have as the example in your head as we go through the webinar today. I'll give you just a minute to put your answer in the chat box. Oh yeah, telehealth, that's a big one. Adopting a new team-based care model, lots of complications associated with that. So putting in some new flows, getting people thinking about things in a really different way. Not an easy feat. Can we get a couple more? What other changes are you currently experiencing or about to undergo? Working from home, a common one right now, has its advantages and its challenges associated with it. Another reference to that, so virtual working with hospitals instead of in-person meetings. It is very challenging to build relationships. I think we've all been stretching ourselves in that direction a little bit. Absolutely some challenges. Thanks, everybody. So let's keep these kinds of changes in mind as we talk about some of our own experiences through change and the experiences of people that we work with. It'll be helpful just to have something in mind as we kind of go through this. So you may have not expected to see a picture of an elephant as we're talking about change, but this analogy comes from, there's a couple different sources for it, but the reference that I really like, and we have references listed at the end of this slide deck, is a book called Switch, which is about managing change. If you haven't read it and you're somebody who's responsible for implementing and helping folks work through change, I would highly recommend it. So Chip and Dan Heath are a set of brothers who have written a couple of really good books, which is one of them. It's about managing change, and they make a really great analogy. So they say that whenever we're experiencing change or we're driving a change, our brains are operating really on two levels, the rational level and the emotional level. And they liken the rational side to a rider. So the rational side of us, or the rider in us, creates a plan and kind of methodically directs activities toward the end goal or the desired change. And a lot of the literature that's out there on managing change focuses on that rational side, the rider side. So how do you plan? How do you identify milestones? How do you identify challenges and ways to work through those? But what is often overlooked is the emotional side, or in the analogy that is used in this book, the elephant. So change is a really emotional process. And if you think about some of the changes that you put in the chat box, so changing it to telehealth or a team care model or working from home or trying to build relationships virtually, there's a big emotional part of that. And if you're focused on something big or something little, there's the logical, rational side of you that tells you the change makes sense or it doesn't make sense, or it's challenging or it's not challenging. And that rational part of you kind of lays out a plan for carrying out that change. But then there's the emotional side. So having to get out of your comfort zone, having to live with some uncertainty and some doubt, and second guessing whether you made the right decision. Did we really lay this out well? Did we get the right people involved? So there's a lot of emotion that comes along with that uncertainty. And if you look at this picture, the rider sort of looks like he's in charge, but he's really pretty small compared to the elephant. And if there's disagreement between the two, we kind of know who's going to win, right? So the elephant's going to win every time. And this very same thing happens when the rational and emotional parts of our brain are in conflict. The emotional side wins almost every time. So in our conversation today, we're certainly not going to ignore the rider or the rational side of things. We'll talk about the importance of things like having a good reason for initiating the change and creating clear goals, but we're really going to zero in on the elephant, or the emotional side of change, which is, my background is in psychology, so that's the part that I get really interested in. And we can't successfully lead any change initiative without having a really good understanding of other people's elephants or their emotions, as well as our own. And when change efforts fail, it's very often due to the elephants. But the elephant is also the one who helps us get things done. So that emotional side is the one that keeps us motivated and keeps us engaged when things get challenging and gets us curious. The elephant is really important to move forward, but it can also get in our way. There's a growing body of research about the impact that emotions have on a lot of processes that we have historically thought of as quite rational. So there's a couple of examples on this slide. So recent research has found that providers' emotions can impact clinical decisions. There's also been a lot of research in the past decade or so on the role that emotions play in our economic decisions, which we have historically thought of as pretty rational. We're learning that when it comes to money, we're not quite the rational beings we thought we were. And there was one really interesting study that found that not only will bad feelings affect how much we'll pay for something, but different bad feelings mean we'll pay different amounts. So it's not just a positive or negative, but specific emotions will dictate some of the economic decisions that we make. And there was another study where nurses participating in a shared governance initiative picked up on and adopted emotions from their colleagues. So pleasantness or unpleasantness, or feeling very motivated and engaged, or demotivated and disengaged. And that impacted the nurses' perceptions of the legitimacy or the benefits of the initiative and their willingness to participate in it. So we can really catch emotions from each other, which probably doesn't come as a big surprise to any of you. So just for a minute, let's look at the emotions that people often experience over the course of the change. So if you're looking at this curve, it may look familiar to you, and it follows the consecutive stages of grief identified by Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in the 60s. It's been around for a long time. So this probably is nothing new to any of you. But sometimes the connection of the grief cycle with the change cycle can be a new way of thinking about it. So there's been a lot of research conducted since Dr. Kubler-Ross created this curve in the 60s that supports the idea that the same pattern shows up in the emotions that we experience through the course of a change. And so the stages are denial, which is really about shock and feeling a little bit overwhelmed, or feeling that really this may not go forward at all, so I'm not even gonna worry about it. Then there's anger, which really is a manifestation of some underlying pain that sometimes comes out in negative ways toward others. We'll talk a little bit more about each of these in a minute, but just as an overview. Bargaining comes next, which looks like negotiation. So maybe I'll do this if I get this in return. Depression, the low point of the change curve or the grief curve, which is really just about an empty feeling. We're not talking about clinical depression here. We're just talking about just a feeling of emptiness, specifically around the change that's happening. And then when things go well, we kind of come out the other side with a feeling of acceptance, that there's a changed reality, that this new reality is the permanent reality, and it's something that I can accept and I can get behind. Sometimes it's worthwhile to call out the fact that there's something we call the trapdoor of despair at the bottom of this curve. Sometimes at this point in the cycle, it becomes so hard to deal with the change that people drop out. So in this context, it might mean that they quit their job or they ask for a reassignment. They want out. And if you've been through a really difficult change at work before, you might recognize this trapdoor. You might consider leaving your job, or you may have actually done it. Sometimes when people just really choose to leave a job and make a really different change in their career, it's part of just a change that is just not a good fit for us, or one that we just really can't get behind. And this trapdoor of despair can explain some of the reasons that some of us have made this change. So the process of going through change, just like the process of going through grief, is rarely this neat and well-defined. And studies have found that we can move backward and forward on this curve. But as you're going through a change and as you're supporting yourself and other people through a change, it can be helpful to remember that change actually often involves grief. So there's a letting go of the past, and there's a process to getting to the point where you accept a new reality. And this happens even when a change is a positive change. So if something we all think of positive, like winning the lottery, there's still a process of letting go of the past and adjusting to a new reality. So any change involves some letting go, which can show up in a similar way to grief. There was a really interesting study done in 2015 by Anne Scheck-McInerney, who's on the faculty of the medical school at Ohio State University, and there were other research team members as well. And this study is referenced at the end of this slide deck. But they looked at the process of implementing an electronic health record at 6 different health systems across the United States, and they particularly looked at the experience of physicians as they went through the implementation. So they held focus groups with physicians, and from the focus group data, they saw this very same curve in the pattern of experiences that were described by the physicians. So here is just some quick examples. So in the write-up of the study, they included comments made by physicians illustrating each of these stages along the curve. So one example of denial is this statement. So it's probably been one of the most unsettling things I've seen for physicians throughout our entire system. There were statements that represented anger. So this may look familiar to some of you who've gone through an EHR implementation, but by the time you've actually done everything you need to do in the EHR, your patient encounter is halfway over. So that's a big source of frustration and potentially burnout for providers, as we know, who aren't able to spend the amount of time that they would like to spend with patients. Some bargaining showed up. So why do I need a cover letter? Isn't enough if I have a progress note? So I'm willing to put a progress note in there. Cover letter may be a little bit too much for me. There were some evidence of depression, including that trapdoor of despair. So in the first 2 weeks we did this, one provider said, I could have just quit medicine. And as we know, there's a lot of evidence right now of EHR changes leading to some of this. People just deciding they've had enough and it's time to get out. There were comments illustrating acceptance. So here's one example. I have all I need at my fingertips. I think it's a great system. We know this is not the way it goes every time, but there have been some examples of EHR implementations that turned out well in the end, and providers really got behind it. So again, you might be looking at this and thinking, oh yeah, this sounds really nice and neat. We know it's not as simple as this, and you're absolutely right. It's almost as a rule, much messier than this. But the point is that when you see or hear these kinds of things from people experiencing a change, it can be helpful to know that this is all a normal part of the process. And when you hear comments like this, you can start to think about where that person might be on the curve, and then come up with some strategies for helping them as a result. One thing I always like to say to people before I move on is, if you're a leader responsible for implementing a change and you have people who are angry, that actually can be a good sign, because what it means is they're moving along the curve. So they're past denial, now they're at anger. It doesn't mean it's a pleasant place to be, and it doesn't mean they don't have some valid points and you need to have some dialogue at that point, but the fact that anger exists means they're out of denial. So there's some progress being made along the curve. So Andy, can you pull up the first poll question? Thanks. So the question is, for the change that you identified earlier, whether you typed it in the chat box or you just thought of it in your head, think about the person who either is currently having the hardest time with that change or might have the hardest time with that change when it comes up. And think about which of those stages are they in? Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. And if it's you, that's fine. You can put yourself on that curve somewhere. So we've got some bargaining, some anger, acceptance. Nice, moving right along the curve. Thanks, everybody. So in a couple minutes, we'll come back to this, to these 5 different stages and talk about ways to help people who are at each part of the curve. And acceptance is a tricky one. It's great to have to feel like the group is really moving to that end of the curve at acceptance. But there's some things to keep in mind, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So thanks, everybody. We'll close this poll down. Bargaining is the winner. So if you've ever gone through change as part of a group, or if you've led a group through change, you know that people respond to change in different ways. And sometimes these differences happen because of the circumstances, so things happening outside of the person. And sometimes the different responses can be attributed, we can attribute those to differences in the characteristics of the person, him or herself. So let's look at this in just a little bit more detail. So individuals' responses to change can certainly be dependent on the amount of input that different people have had during the planning process. So for example, if you've created a new website to connect job seekers with employers, but during the development of that, you only got input from one of the major employers in your area, you might get less cooperation from representatives of the other employers. So feeling like we have input in the change process makes a big difference. Responses to change can also depend on the level of understanding that each person has, both understanding of the need for the change and what can be expected as the process continues. So just think of something simple like your office being moved to another building. So we're moving offices. You're much more likely to be more comfortable with the change if you know why the move is happening and if you kind of know what to expect between now and the move. And you might be thinking, well, yeah, this is a no-brainer. Of course, we need to know why we're changing. But the fact is that we often assume that people understand a lot more than they do. And this is something to especially be aware of when you're part of the group leading the change. So when we're really immersed in something and we've been thinking about it for a long time and we've been working on it for a while, we tend to make the mistake of overestimating the level of understanding that those who have not been involved in the change have. And many experts recommend doing what might feel to you like over-explaining to those who'll be impacted by the change. Because often when we get to the point where we just feel like we can't talk about it one more time, we've just scratched the surface of what people are looking for who are going to be affected by the change. And then there are 2 more differences that on the surface might feel like no-brainers, but there's a little bit more to them than meets the eye. So one of them is the nature of the change. So the no-brainer part is that change is less stressful if the other person perceives it as minor, if it's additive rather than subtractive, so if the person gets something good rather than losing something, or is initiated by the person, him or herself, rather than a change that's imposed by somebody. But the more that meets the eye part is the word perceived. So that the word perceived is really important here. So it's all about the perception of the person. So what we might perceive as a minor change, like getting a new office chair or making an office move, might actually be perceived by the other person as a major change. And so it's that thinking about the other person's perception can be really important. And then there's the area of impact that the change will have. And this is something that I learned about many years ago, and I come back to it over and over and over again. And I just want to share it with you. So let's take a look at that. So in the 80s, Noel Tishy, who was on the faculty of the Ross School of Business at the University of Michigan, developed a way of classifying the types of impact that changes can have on any given person. And a lot of research has built on the theory since then. It's become a really valuable tool for helping others while a change is in process. And we have a resource to share with you that Andy, just whenever you get a chance, Andy will put a link to the PDF in the chat box. But so let's take the example of let's use the example of integrating behavioral health screening into primary care. So I've done a lot of work with rural health networks who spend a lot of time and effort working to integrate behavioral health into primary care. So let's think a little about the impact this would have on a primary care provider or a nurse or a medical assistant new to these screenings and the field of behavioral health in general. So when they first hear about the proposal, they might be wondering about the technical aspects. So do I know enough about behavioral health to really do this justice? Do I have the resource of time? Do I have time to fit this in alongside the other things that I do? Or is this just one more thing I'm gonna have to do hundreds of clicks in order to get done? So that's the technical part. Do I have the resources that I need to address this change? And do I have the knowledge that I need to address this change? Another area of impact to think about is the political aspect. So everyone affected by the change has their sense of their own power and influence in the current state. So in the example of integrating behavioral health into primary care, a provider might wonder if doing this kind of screening means they no longer have any control over any behavioral health related discussions with the patient. Or if there's someone who has a lot of experience in behavioral health but no input on the screening form, they may not have had enough influence into the process from the beginning. They could also be thinking about, so that's the political piece. All of us, and this isn't the negative side of politics or the negative side of power and influence, but every one of us comes to work wanting to make a contribution and to have a unique contribution because of our perspectives and our knowledge and skills. And anytime a change comes, it can threaten some of that. What's my value here, and what contribution do I bring to the organization and to my patients? And so it's something to be thinking about as somebody driving a change, is how is this going to change each person's perspective of the value that they bring to what we do here. And you might also think about the cultural aspect. So how does the new process connect with my values as an individual? Going back to the behavioral health integration into primary care, if the long-held mindset of a provider is behavioral health is one thing, physical health is another thing, and they're really two separate things that need to be addressed separately, a new process of integrating the two kind of goes against that mindset. And so it's not just about, do I have the knowledge? It's not just about, do I still have the contribution that I had before, but does this really jive with how I see things, what my mindset is? And if, on the other hand, that integrated approach really fits with their view, if that's how they view health as being this integrated, the two of them really being integrated, then they might have an easier time with it. So you can see when we've got all these different moving pieces and how every single person has their own definition in each of these three areas, there's a lot to keep track of and keep straight as somebody working to help a group through a change. The nice thing is when you've taken some time to think things through, there are some specific strategies for addressing each of them. So we'll talk about those in a minute. But before we get to that, I'm going to throw up this, or Andy's going to throw up this poll question. So think again about the person who could be struggling a lot with a change that's underway or a change that's coming up. Which of those three areas do you think might be the biggest source of concern for them? And again, if it's you, that's fine. Which of these might be the biggest source of concern for you? And we've got a close horse race. Looks like we may, I thought we were gonna have a three-way tie. So the cultural piece has taken the lead. Now it's a strong lead. So let's end this poll. And the cultural piece is a complicated piece. It's a lot of deep-seated mindsets, deep-seated things that are the values that we've developed over time and feel pretty strongly about. That's a challenge to address those. So we'll come back to each of those in a few minutes, and we'll look at ways that you can address each of those areas of impact when you're thinking about strategies for helping others through change. We'll come right back to it. So put a pin in that one for a minute. So we said sometimes the differences in the way that people react to change are the kind of things happening outside them. We can also think about personal characteristics of the people involved. So sometimes people's reactions can be impacted by their past experience with the topic. They may have more or less experience with it, or they may have had a negative experience. So you think about again, I'll go to a network example that's kind of top of mind for me right now. So if you're working on building a coalition or you're building some partnerships, and one of the group of people you're working to build a relationship with has been burned in the past by somebody else in the group, that stakeholder could be coming into the initial conversations thinking that collaboration just really isn't a risk they're willing to take. They've been burned with it before. They really don't want to go through that again. And then there's also some underlying personality traits that lead to people being more or less comfortable with new experiences, comfortable with ambiguity, and being more prone to anxiety than others. And as we know, change can be a pretty anxiety-producing situation. So in a minute, we'll talk a little bit about how to work with these differences, but there's one thing I just really want to point out before we move on, and that's something called the fundamental attribution error. So I try not to bring a lot of psycho jargon in here, but I think this is a really interesting concept. So the fundamental attribution error is a psychological principle supported by decades and decades of research. And what we know is that, I'm gonna put up my little caution tape graphic. What we know is that human beings tend to attribute other people's behavior to who they are rather than the situation they're in. But we attribute our own behavior in the opposite way. So we explain our behavior as due to the situation rather than who we are. So say you're changing software. I'm not in favor of changing software or implementing a new EHR because nobody asked for my department's input and the one that was chosen doesn't meet our needs. So I'm attributing my resistance or my anxiety about a change to the situation. Sometimes if we're the ones responsible for implementing a change and we've got resistance or anxiety on the part of somebody else, so my coworker doesn't want to change to this new software or new AHR because she just can never handle anything new. She's just really got trouble with change. So in the context of what we're talking about today, that means when we have people who aren't quite as excited about a change as we are, we kind of tend to this fundamental attribution error. So we tend to attribute their lack of enthusiasm to a personal trait. They're stubborn, they're just anxious about everything, rather than anything in the environment. And if you're leading a change initiative, the really good news is you have a lot of influence over the way people experience that change. So personality traits may play a role, but it's kind of a small role. And so as someone driving a change, it's up to you to figure out how to set up the environment and how to help people with the things we've just talked about in a way that taps into what's important for them and what's right for them. So that's the good news, that you've got a lot of control over this. The bad news, as I'm sure you know by now, is this is not easy. You have a lot of different people, a lot of different perspectives to be juggling at the same time as you're just trying to deal with the logistics of getting a change initiative going. So given all this, what can we do to set up the environment in ways that help other people navigate the change process? So I'm going to go back to our rider and elephant analogy for a minute, and remember that the rider represents logic and reason, and the elephant represents emotions. So to help others with change, you've got to think about both the rider and the elephant. So the rider does the planning, the elephant provides the energy. So let's go back to the change curve and talk about a couple of things you can do when individual people are at different spots on the change curve. So when someone's stuck in denial, you'll hear them say things like, this is never going to happen, this is just the flavor of the month, it's eventually all going to go away. My needs are totally different than everyone else's, this really won't work for me. My husband is a mid-level leader in a healthcare organization. This is where he is about the transition to value. He's still in denial. So we have interesting conversations over the dinner table about that. So the first thing to do is to listen to what the person is saying. Is it true that their needs are totally different? And if so, are there any adjustments you can make to accommodate these differences? This is not just a how do you kind of convince people to walk through. These are good opportunities to have two-way conversations. So are there any adjustments you can make to accommodate the differences? If you hear people say this is just a flavor of the month, that gives you a little bit of insight into their past experience. So it very often means they've been disappointed by change efforts in the past. And it's helpful to understand that. That being said, there's a couple of things you can do when someone is stuck in denial. One is to have just a really honest conversation. So this is really happening, and here's why this is really happening. So sometimes you have to have some pretty candid conversations to make sure that people understand why things are happening, get some evidence behind the fact that yes, it's really happening, and what the impact will be if we don't start moving toward and making some progress toward where we need to be. Because the fact is that people who are stuck in denial very often don't really understand what the end goal is going to look like. So it can really be helpful to reiterate why the change is being proposed, whether it's the impact that it will have on quality or whatever it is the change is targeting, and to really spell out that vision clearly. Sometimes anger shows up, and a couple of you noted in the poll that you know of people who are kind of stuck in this spot on the change curve. This could show up really out in the open with raised voices and angry facial expressions like the guy in the slide. Comments like, this is going to make my job so much harder. But sometimes it can be more subtle, just like not showing up for meetings, or having the meetings after the meeting, so speaking up negatively about the project outside the group. But either way, when someone's stuck here, you can again have some honest conversations where you acknowledge what's difficult, listening to their point of view, again, making sure that we're keeping these as two-way conversations, making adjustments wherever you can, and affirming your support. So that might involve giving them more time if possible, any other support that will be helpful. And you'll see again that communicating the vision is listed here. Some people just get bogged down so far in the details that it's hard to keep the end goal in mind. And so reminding them of why you're going through and doing what you're doing can be really helpful to pull people a little bit out of the weeds and have them kind of look farther down the road. And it can also be helpful if you've really got someone who's stuck in anger, to find others, to bring others into the conversation, and ask those who do support the change to have some conversations with him or her, with the person stuck in anger, and share their perspective. So it doesn't always have to be you. If you've got people in the bargaining phase, you'll hear things like, wow, I could have done this if we'd had more notice, or if this change was made, this might just work. And this is actually a really good sign that the person's moving along the curve. They're thinking about how it might actually happen. And it's even possible that you could bypass the depression phase on the curve and skip right to acceptance if you can make any adjustments to the plan that kind of fit with their needs. So sometimes their bargaining chip is a little more time or a little bit more resources, and if that's doable, consider implementing any suggestions that they have. But this is the point where you get to, sometimes there are non-negotiables that just can't happen, but sometimes there's a little bit of wiggle room to get the person or to get that group kind of moving along toward the end goal. So here we are at depression. And again, we're not talking about clinical depression. We're just talking about kind of this empty, defeated feeling that sometimes comes through the course of a change. And people who are at this stage just need some support and some time to process. It can be really helpful for people here to know that you know they're having a hard time and that you're there to help in any way you can. Time is sometimes just the remedy, just to give them space to process if that's available. But don't forget that trapdoor of despair. So there is a risk of people leaving at this point. So it's really important to be paying close attention and providing extra support if this is something you don't want to happen. And I remember on the poll earlier, some of you said people were at acceptance. That's awesome. That's a really good place to be. So if you've got people who've reached acceptance, though, I would just caution you not to just check them off the list and move on. So remember, we can slide back and forth on this curve. So it's important, even if you've got somebody at acceptance, just to keep checking in to see how things are going with them, to keep them engaged in the process. One way to help keep them engaged is to get them involved with bringing others along. So again, you can kind of build a coalition to kind of keep moving people through the process and addressing people's concerns to keep people moving along. This is if you've got somebody at acceptance who has walked in the shoes of somebody who's still a little bit farther back on the curve, and have worked through some of the same concerns that that person's experiencing, that can be a really good person to bring into the conversation. Again, these examples are really pretty simplified. The way we experience change is not always wrapped up in a nice, tidy little bow like this diagram shows, but it can be helpful just to keep this big picture in your mind about what change looks like, and to help you think about where other people might be, as well as yourself. So again, we talked about the technical, political, cultural impacts that change has on people. There are some specific strategies that you can use, and thanks, Andy, for putting that in the chat box. There's a worksheet that you can use to kind of think this through. So if you have somebody who's stuck farther back on one of those challenging parts of the change curve, take a look at this framework. I really encourage you to do it. I have found it to be very helpful. I've worked with hospitals who found it to be helpful. So, and to help you think through what the sticking point is. So say you've got somebody who's stuck in anger, really angry, just doesn't seem to be moving along the change curve. It can be helpful to go back to this technical, political, cultural view of change and try to identify where the sticking point is. So is it a technical issue where they're concerned they don't know enough or they don't have the resources? If so, you can do some of the things listed here. So you can provide education. If it's a knowledge issue, you can work with them to agree on the amount of time needed to do it. You can listen to requests for resources if that's something that you can make happen that might help the person move along. Just to be patient for people who need a little bit more time to process, if again, that's available to you. Is it political, where they have a lot of power, a lot of influence as things currently stand, but have concerns about losing it when the change happens, then there are some things you can do here. You can have some honest discussions about their role and what value you see them bringing in the new way of being, to address their concerns about their influence. Is it cultural, where there's a potential mismatch between their values or the way that things have always been and the way that they're going to be? So how can you tap into what's important to that person, what their values are and their priorities, and connect that with the desired state or where you're heading to with the change? So when you identify the specific category, the technical or political or cultural, that people might be stuck in, not only can you identify some specific ways to address them, but it also helps feel a little bit more empathy for the people impacted by the change, which can impact your own feelings about the person, which can then help you build a stronger relationship and help them move along the change curve a little more effectively. So for those personal characteristics that lead to differences in the way that people respond to change, when you've got people with less experience with the topic or a negative experience with the topic, they just need more support. They may need a little bit more attention. They may need a little bit more information, a little bit of hand-holding to help them feel comfortable as you move along the process of the change initiative. People who are less comfortable with ambiguity and people who tend toward more anxiety during change need as much detail as you can give them. So share the plan, make sure they really understand where you're going, what's the end vision, check in with them frequently to provide some direction, to provide detail. I know this takes a ton of time. I have no illusions that this is an easy thing to do. But if you've got the time available to put in on the front end, it will save so much time and energy on the back end when you've got to keep kind of coming back around and trying to move people along. The more you can keep everybody as comfortable as possible early on, the faster things will go and the better everybody will feel about it along the way. So again, just a couple of reminders. There's two things to keep in mind. One is that when we're really immersed in something, we tend to think that other people understand it as well as we do. So when you think about it, when you're responsible for implementing something new, you spend a lot of time gathering input from other people, leading discussions, putting together plans, putting together the vision and timelines. And we forget that often when we're just kind of ready to put things into place, other people are just getting used to the idea that the change is happening. And so we're way down the road and sometimes have a little bit of have the illusion that other people are farther along than they are. So I just encourage you to have patience, have empathy for the people who are just learning about the idea, and to use some of the strategies that we talked about today to help them along the way. And the other is just that fundamental attribution error. Next time you find yourself thinking, oh, sadly, there she goes again, she's just being her difficult self, just think about our tendency to attribute other people's behavior to their challenging personalities. And just remind yourself that there's probably some external factors at play that you could address and that you could have some impact over. We have some, Andy, do you hear that music?
I do. If everyone can, I'll just mute.
Okay.
All right, and then Shannon, if you want to unmute.
Okay, thank you. It sounded like somebody's holding music. Let's just talk before we go about managing our own emotions during the change process. So, when you're leading a change, you're not only responsible for paying attention to other people's elephants, but you got your own to manage, your own little emotional elephant. The positive emotions that we experience when we're leading a challenging project give us a lot of momentum toward our goal. So our elephant is our friend when we've got it going in the direction that we want it to go. So when we feel energized, that usually means that our rider and our elephant are aligned. Our emotions are driving us in the direction our rational side is aiming for. But when we feel frustrated or we feel demoralized, it can be difficult to keep working toward that end vision. I'm probably not telling anybody anything you don't know. It's just hard to stay motivated. I'm sure you've all experienced some of this, but you've still made some significant changes. So I know you've all had success managing your own elephants. But I'll just share a couple tips that could be helpful the next time you feel that your elephant is moving a little bit away from the direction you'd like. So the first thing to do is just to honor that elephant. So just to recognize when you're feeling frustrated or you're feeling de-energized, just try to recognize it without judging yourself. Oh, I can tell I'm just feeling really frustrated today. Sometimes when you identify how you're feeling, you might be able to connect it to a spot on the change curve. So if you're feeling really frustrated or really low on a specific day, you could really approach it the same way you would if you were helping somebody else experience a change. So feeling really demoralized might be a sign that you're kind of at the dip of depression on the curve. And what do we do when somebody is in that dip? We give them time, we express support for them. So on a demoralizing day, you can really manage your own elephant by acknowledging how you're feeling, giving yourself space to feel that way, and gather yourself together. There's a really interesting book called Emotional Agility by Dr. Susan David, who's on the faculty in Harvard's medical school. She's done a lot of research on, it's almost taking emotional intelligence to the next level. So how do we really influence our own emotions? And she's found that when we give ourselves permission to feel what we're feeling, the feeling goes away much more quickly than if we try to fight it or we try to kind of bottle it up. So if you just allow yourself to feel disheartened or allow yourself to feel angry or allow yourself to feel frustrated without judging yourself for it, you'll quickly, or you'll regain your energy a little bit more quickly than if you tried to kind of fight it and muscle through. And so just like when you're thinking about other people who are stuck, are they at the technical, political, or cultural question? Where are they? Which one of these is the biggest sticking point for them? You can be thinking about that for yourself too. Are you unsure about what to do next because you just don't quite have the knowledge that you need? What do you need to do then to address that? Is it a political thing? Is it a cultural thing? And you can use some of the same strategies that you would use when other people are stuck there to kind of help yourself through it. So I just really encourage you to not only use this with other people, but with yourself. And the more that you can address these issues to keep your own elephant moving in the right direction, the more you kind of keep yourself moving along that change curve as well. So when we acknowledge and we address the way we feel about a situation, that helps us get our emotional elephant more in line with our rational rider. It's really all about the elephants. Yes, I'm biased. That's the part that's more interesting to me, but it's really about just getting your elephants going in the right directions. As I promised, I'm going to share a little bit about our podcast series, but before I move on, are there any questions? I'll just give a minute for anybody to put a question in the chat box. And Rhonda, I'm just noticing your comment about the 80s when computerized treatment planning came out. Never last. We've all been there. We've all been in that denial stage of the curve. All right, so I don't see any questions coming through. It doesn't mean there's not any typing, but we'll keep checking the chat box as I move on. So as I mentioned, we have recently put together a series of podcasts targeting mid-level leaders, focusing on leading through change. So it's really, we've kind of put it in the package of the why and how of value-based care and population health, and then tools and strategies for leading others through that transition to value. And as I said, it's targeted for mid-level managers, but it can apply to really anyone responsible for influencing others in the workplace. Just some details. So each episode is about a half-hour long, and they include interviews with mid-level managers at rural hospitals across the country. These are managers who are in clinical departments as well as those who are in non-clinical settings. And they share their experiences and approaches to leading themselves and others through change. And every single one of them, I will say, is a rock star. I don't know if any of you are on this. I haven't looked at the participant list. But the folks that were willing to donate their time and effort and energy to sharing their perspectives on these podcasts, they have just really valuable perspectives to share. And I learned a lot just from listening to them. And Rhonda was part of that series as well. And I would guess that Rhonda would probably say the same thing. So we had some of the people that we had were Kyle Sutherland from Bacon County, Georgia, Wesley Babers and Michelle Madrid from White Mountain Regional Medical Center in Arizona. We had Jessica Camacho and Feb Garcia from Roosevelt General Hospital in New Mexico, and Michaela Dempsey from Lexington Regional Health Center in Nebraska. And again, they just have such great philosophies to share. So I would highly encourage you to listen to this podcast, if for no other reason than to learn from them. That is it for the podcast commercial. I'm just going to check the chat box. Yeah, so as we learn to navigate the new norm, and we will, for the rest of our lives, we will all be navigating new norm after new norm after new norm. So that's great. Thank you very much for that comment. So here are just some really helpful resources. Some of these we pulled content from for this webinar, and some I just really recommend as just good resources. Daniel Kahneman is someone I'm a little bit of a groupie about. He is a behavioral economist. He has some really interesting takes on emotions and how we make decisions. I'd highly recommend checking him out. Got the podcast on here, the books that we referenced, and we also, Marshall Goldsmith is another great resource, and we have a lot of other resources on our website. You can search for anything that we've got there. These are the more official references. So if you want to dig into some more of the academic research, they're here on this slide. And I don't see any other questions in the chat box, so I will turn it back over to you, Andy, to wrap us up.
Thank you so much, Shannon, for that great presentation, and thank you everyone for participating. Before you leave, I just threw up a final polling question. If you could answer that on your way out, that would be great. And this recording will be available within 5 business days on the Help Webinar Playback page. At this time, also, I'm going to be posting a link to a short online assessment for the webinar. Completion of that assessment is necessary if you want to receive 1 ACHE qualified education credit for today's webinar. Other than that, the slides are in the chat box along with that handout and the link to the podcast series. If you have any questions, please just let me know. And then, yeah, again, thanks everyone for participating. And thank you, Shannon, for sharing. This has been great. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.